Ready? Yep.
208, take one.
Mila, I want to ask you first of all, in fact, I'm not going to ask you about Plaszow. I'm going to ask you about life in the ghetto.
Okay.
And what the sort of restrictions were that the Germans put on Jews, and what happened to your life as a result.
Well, we came to the ghetto with the least of our possessions. Well, I didn't have too many because I lost everything already in my city of Lodz, you know. I was not from Krakow. But in the Krakow ghetto, we came with the least of our possessions. We had to share apartments, if we had any apartments, with several other families. We had to wear the armbands. We were forced to work. Besides, we were confronted with daily mistreatings, with daily selections, with daily so-called actions, you know, the transports, where they, for instance, one day, Poldek and I, at the time, were working.
Hold on. Sorry, Mila, we have a problem with the microphone.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, it's 10 over.
I'm running. Yep.
208, take two.
Mila, perhaps you can tell me again, because we didn't get any of the sound there.
When we came to the ghetto, first of all, of course, there was a sense of confinement because we couldn't have any privacy. We couldn't have any apartments of our own, like a family should have an apartment. We had to share it. So sometimes one bedroom was shared by several families. They divided the room by some curtains made of sheets and so on. Our possessions were to bare minimum. We were not especially hungry in the Krakow ghetto yet, because if you had a few dollars, you could always, the contact with the outside, a few zlotys rather.
Yeah, well, let's cut and wait for the airplane to go.
Okay.
Let's try again. Mila, sorry, this time.
Oh, please
okay.
don't worry about me.
Not too nervous this time, I hope.
Running.
Okay, good. Okay, 10 over.
Okay, 208, take three.
So, Mila, if you want to tell me again
About us being in the ghetto, about the confinement of our living quarters. Oh, you
Just
want
start
me to...
when we came to the ghetto.
When we came to the ghetto, the
Sorry,
first...
just wait until I finish speaking.
Okay, I'm
Then-
sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You can say
Now?
whatever you like.
Okay. When we came to the ghetto, the first feeling was a feeling of confinement, of restrictions. We could not stay, you know, in the apartments by ourselves, like a family by family. We had to share it with other families. The rooms were divided by curtains made of sheets, etc. You know, our possessions were minimal. We had very little. We were forced to work because not to work meant that you, at the next selection, if you could not produce some certificate of employment, you could not stay in the ghetto. You would be forced to leave the ghetto, and your occupation had to be, let's say, important to the war effort. Otherwise, you also couldn't stay. We were faced every single day with some surprises, some actions. That means the Germans came, surrounded the ghetto, made selections to the left, to the right. Some people were gathered and transported out of the ghetto and were never seen again. For instance, one time my husband and I were working at a German army, excuse me, it was like a convalescent home.
Can I stop you?
Sure.
Can you start the story from one day we were working at a convalescent home?
Okay. Day we were working at a convalescent home outside of the ghetto, where the German soldiers were brought for a recuperation period, I suppose so, from the front. And after the day's work, usually they took us on the buses and brought us to the gates of the ghetto. That evening they said, "You're not going back. For the night we need you early in the morning to start or something." We had a feeling, our whole group, that something was happening, but we couldn't ask any questions. The next day we worked all day, and about the time, you know, of when the work ended, they brought us back to the ghetto. The ghetto was half empty. They rounded up the people. They took out the sick, the children, the people who didn't have work permits, the mothers and the children. We couldn't find half of Poldek's family. Everybody was gone. So this was these things happened, and it was becoming worse and worse and worse every day. People were not hungry because I think you could manage to buy maybe not the luxuries, but the bare necessities of life. We did it, and so we still, because afterwards, when we came to Plaszow and to Auschwitz, we realized how much worse the conditions were over there.
Okay. Do you want to take a glass of water, maybe,
Yeah.
just to make yourself clear? Okay. Tell me a little bit about conditions in Plaszow.
In Plaszow, the conditions were worse, of course, than in the ghetto, because we did not live in apartments. We lived on bunks in barracks, which we had a big lice problem at the beginning. So we were very busy, taking care of that. In the summer, we had an avalanche of bed bugs, but a literal avalanche of bed bugs. We were hungrier. We were, every single day, at the beginning I was going out of Plaszow to Optima factory every day, and at the gates of when we were coming back home, we were asking questions, how many today? This was like a tragicomical joke, and they said like 5-0, 10-0, that means how many got killed that day. This was the communique we got by the gates. If some people were able to organize it, as we called, outside of the camp, to bring some food, there were searches by the gate, and they had to leave everything, by the gate. We were cramped. We had to give, one night they came and they told us to give everything we had as far as jewelry and money. So whoever had a little bit still left, they had to give it unless they hid it. But not so many people were so courageous, because this was a death penalty for finding something like this. I gave everything I had. And then we started to work in the Madrid factory, which was already located in in Plaszow. And work conditions also. We had night shifts, for instance, so we had to work at night. And again,
Don't have to worry with Madrid's factory. How much more have we got left? Okay. Tell me about the day that you were rounded up to get onto the train to go to Brennitz, as you thought.
To Brennitz. We were told, you see, the men went to Brennitz a week ahead of us, and we didn't know what's going to happen, but we were hoping, of course, believing in Mr. Schindler. Absolutely, we believed that very soon we will go there. So they rounded us up in the cattle trains, and we traveled, I don't know exactly how long, but I'm sure that 2 days and 1 night, or 2 nights and 1 day, something like this, and not knowing where we're going to go, but we were sure we're going to arrive in Brennitz. And they let us out in the middle of the night. Immediately, we realized it was not Brennitz, it was Auschwitz. It was the dogs and the SS and the terrible, screaming by the SS, and we were being rounded up into the sauna where they stripped us of everything, and our transport, our 300 women were not tattooed. They shaved some of the women's heads, some were not shaven. We were given some outlandish clothing, and then the 3 weeks of terror, hunger, and misery began. This was the worst 3 weeks of my life, I will never forget it. Well, we still believed that Mr. Schindler will get us out of there. Toward the end, our belief and our hope was vanishing a little bit, but we still held on to it.
How much left, Mary?
1.5.
Can you tell me, when you were escorted into the shower there at Auschwitz, what you thought?
Well, when we were escorted to the shower at the very first day, we were not sure what's going to happen, whether the gas will come or the water. But you see, the thing is that people were so full of hope. We never, the sky was all red around us. The smell was kind of different, but we still didn't believe that those things were going on. Even when we were told by the Slovak women who were in Auschwitz from the very beginning, that means since 1940 or something, and they were telling us, you're not going to survive. When we asked if we could keep this of our possession or that, why are you worried about it? You're not going to live another day. And so we weren't sure what's going to happen afterwards. But still, we hoped that everything would be all right. That's the optimist, the perennial optimism of the Jews, I suppose. And when we arrived in Brindlitz, okay.
Running.
209, take 1.
Mila, tell me how you heard about the list.
I was working at Madridge workshops with a friend of mine who told me that there is a list being formed, and by all means I should speak to my husband and try to get on that list. And my husband said, oh, come on, we will never get on it, and so on. But I think that he started to talk to the people at the administration, and he was quite well known. He was from Krakow, everybody knew my husband, and maybe I think he talked his way in. He couldn't, do it any other way because we had nothing, we were not working for Schindler at the time, although my husband knew Schindler from the very beginning. But in Plaszow, we worked somewhere else. We did not work at Emalia, but we were taken in, so it was almost a miracle.
What did Ludwig Feigenbaum...
I've got you a minute.
Yeah.
Could you sit up a little bit?
Sure.
Only the fill of...
Is that okay?
That's better, thank you.
Mila, why did Ludwig say it was important for you to get onto the list? And if you can start the story again, I was working at Madrid, so tell me the same story. Don't worry about how you got on the list.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about how you heard about it and why it was important to go on the list.
I heard about Schindler's List from a very good friend of mine, Ludwig Feigenbaum, and he told me it's very important that we get that the Schindler List is being formed, and it's extremely important because this is a list, as he put it, for life, that we will go to another camp in Sudetenland, and we're going to be working there, and knowing Mr. Schindler by reputation and by his treatment of workers and the conditions which he created for his workers, we knew that this is our chance, and my husband started to work on it. He probably persuaded some people at the administration that we should get on it, and we got on it.
Your husband knew Mr. Schindler from quite early in the war.
Yes, my husband.
Did you ever talk to Poldek about Schindler and so on?
Oh, we talked constantly because he was such an unusual man that the whole family fell in love with him, so to speak, immediately. He came to my mother-in-law's apartment, in which we also stayed, because even in those days we had to share an apartment, my mother and his parents and so on. And he engaged my mother-in-law into some interior. That means she was making curtains for him and so on, because this was her profession. In the meantime, my husband was the one who always delivered the things which were being made. And he gave my husband certain assignments. You couldn't go to the store and buy things. There was no stores anymore. You couldn't buy it. So my husband got some, let's say, some shirts or some things and brought it to his apartment, for which Mr. Schindler paid him. And let's say the commission, my husband made a commission on it.
Running.
210, take 1.
Mila, when you were in Auschwitz, describe for me a little bit the experience of being a prisoner in Auschwitz, living next to the gas ovens.
Well, it was a constant nightmare from the very beginning. We were herded first in ghetto, the zone, I suppose, stripped of everything. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I think the word's a shower in English, isn't it?
They
Zona.
called it a zona.
Yeah, if you can say
Yeah.
zona or what we call
So
English
the
a shower.
showers, yeah.
Yeah, if you could start right from the beginning again.
Okay. When we arrived in Auschwitz, we were herded right away into the showers. Before the showers, we were stripped of everything. Some of the ladies were shaven, some were not. We were given, first from the very beginning, we realized in Auschwitz that everything was meant for death, not for life. You know, there was no soap. There was no glass in the windows. The water, of course, was freezing cold. This was November in Auschwitz, you know. We were given the so-called Dutch shoes, the wooden clogs, you know, and the mud was up to our mid calves. And, you know, you were walking in those wooden clogs, and the clogs remained in the mud, and we continued walking. You know, we had no stockings, of course, no underwear of any kind, no sanitary conditions of any kind, absolutely no toilet paper, nothing that a woman, let's say, needs for her sanitary condition. And we began to be very, very hungry because the diet was zero. So but we couldn't even eat what we've got because we all developed dysentery. So for instance, to illustrate the conditions, like, let's say, of course, during the day, we walk to the latrine, not always making it on time. But let's say at night, I had an experience like this when I got off my bunk and I walked. During the night, you couldn't go to the latrine. So there was a big, big pail there. I walked to the pail, and with my luck, the pail was full. And the lady who was in charge of the pail said, you cannot, you know, you have to take that pail with the next one who is going to get up before, of course, it's too late, you know, and here you have no possibility of even washing yourself well, and so on. Then there were constant roll calls, constant terror from the women guards and the SS, but mostly women guards because they were in the immediate proximity of us. During the roll calls, we were supporting each other because some of us were ready to collapse, you see, and we were staying on roll call for hours. We were taking little beads that we had in the soup and putting it as instead of rouge on our cheeks, because when they did make a selection, they based it on the physical appearance of a person. So if you were a little too pale or too weak looking, they took you out. Luckily, from our transport, the 300 Schindler women, I think that they took out at the very beginning only 2 older ladies, from which I think one made it back, and we were preserved as a whole group together. We slept, I think, about 13 to the bunk. I don't know how we did it, but we did it, you know, in one direction. We didn't know what the tomorrow will bring. We saw the other women who were even worse than us because they were longer in Auschwitz than we were. I will never forget the experience that's constantly in my mind. When one time, I don't know why, but probably I was sent with another 1 or 2 girls to bring the so-called cereal, you know, the cream of or whatever, you know, the porridge or whatever, which was really water, hot water. And as we were walking with that from the kitchen to our barrack, there were shadows of women appeared because it was like 4 o'clock in the morning, with shaven heads, already dressed in these tattered clothes of Auschwitz, and they put their bowls that they had, which they probably used for other purposes also, into our cereal and grabbed it on the way as we were carrying it. They were so terribly hungry. They had no control of their actions or their emotions or nothing. And we were thinking, my God, are we going to become like that, you know? So that's one of the most terrifying experiences, and the total feeling of hopelessness, because we didn't know. We hoped that Schindler will get us out, but how could we be sure? Yeah.
Can you describe for me, if you remember it, and it may be difficult for you, the smell, because the way the Schindler women were kept were right next to the gas ovens, weren't they?
It was, I could not define the smell. We knew it was a bad smell coming out. The sky would impress me more than the smell. What not impressed me, but what attracted our attention more was the sky, which was forever red. You know, and we still, I don't know, I'm speaking about myself and maybe a few women immediately, my closest friends, we didn't believe it was happening around us. Even though we saw this, we thought, how, because there is no precedent in history which can show us that something like this could happen. That's why maybe we didn't believe it, even though we were told around by the fellow prisoners that it's happening. We were not believing it. When we came to Brünlitz, I'm jumping a little bit ahead of me, and we got out of the train, and we knew it was Brünlitz, of course, because, oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
I think we nearly ran out on them, yeah? 35 seconds. Okay, let's jump for 35 seconds. Amazing. Okay, let's turn over.
Running.
211, take 1.
Mila, I want to ask you about your arrival at Brünlitz, and started from when we arrived at Brünlitz.
Okay, when we arrived in Brünlitz, if I remember correctly, it was very early in the morning, and it was cold, and it was gray. And of course, when we got out of the cattle trains, completely dirty, and besides this, we were smeared with paint, you know, because they smeared us with paint before we left Auschwitz, so in case somebody intended to escape, would be easily spotted, you know, on the way. So we arrived, and we got off the train, and we formed the fives, you know, as usually we did, and I always had the same 5 women, you know, together, and one of my girlfriends said, you know, look at the chimneys. We came here, and they're going to gas us, and her name was Margot, and I said, Margot, you know, they could have done it in Auschwitz. We are now coming to Schindler. I'm sure they won't do it. So they marched us to the side of the camp, and the gates were open, and we walked in, and Schindler was standing there in his little Tyrolean hat with a little feather, and he was surrounded by SS officers, guards, and women guards. And he smiled at us and greeted us and says, look, finally you are with me, and don't worry. Now you are safe, you don't have to worry. And making a statement like this, after all, it was 6 months before the war ended, no one knew when it will end. This took some courage on his part to make a statement like this in front of these Germans. Then I noticed, because the building in which the camp, it was really a factory building. The factory, as I realized later, was downstairs, and our sleeping quarters were upstairs, and there was a balcony running along the front of the entire building, and I noticed a few men standing in the striped uniforms of Grossrosen, which they didn't wear in Płaszów yet, having their heads shaven with a little, what we call a lice promenade, you know, and I saw my husband. And of course, you know, seeing him and all the other ladies seeing some of their close family, it was really total. And Mr. Schindler said, now go to the factory hall. The soup and the bread is prepared for you. Even though the factory wasn't finished yet. I mean, our sleeping quarters, we slept on straw, on the floor. It didn't matter because we were with him, and we knew that from that time on, providing something unforeseen would happen, we are safe, because if it were in his power and in his, he would take care of us. So.
Let's turn over.
I'm running.
212, take 1.
Mila, tell me about when you were in the factory, just outside the factory. There was Schindler with his little hat on, and you saw your husband after you'd spent 3 weeks in Auschwitz.
I saw my husband all of a sudden along with a few other men. We're standing on the balcony above. And, our hearts were so full and so full of gratitude towards Schindler. Our husbands looked differently than they looked in Płaszów because they were wearing already the striped uniforms of Gross Rosen, and their heads were kind of shaven with the Lice Promenade in the middle. And we really realized that and my husband got terribly upset, as he told me later, because all of us were painted with the red paint, so he thought that we are hurt from far away. He didn't realize what it was. But then we had kind of a reunion in the factory hall because Mr. Schindler said the soup is prepared and the bread, so please go in and feel at home. So we went in, and my husband had a present for me. He had a mirror and the needle that he made by himself, and he made also a toothbrush out of some horse's hair or something, which I shared later with my bunkmate, For the entire 6 months, we shared the toothbrush. And we had to sleep on the floor, on the straw, which didn't matter at all. The showers were not quite finished, but our people, the men, built it, and it was just wonderful, and we could communicate with our men either through the partition in the balcony, which divided the men's quarters from the ladies' quarters, and this was like our telephone. We were standing there, the men on one side, the ladies on the other side, and we were speaking, or through the latrine. The men got some access to ladies' latrine, and we were calling the ladies to it.
You had been in the worst concentration camp probably in the history of the war, Auschwitz.
Yes.
Can you compare for me the one concentration camp, Auschwitz, and the other concentration camp, Brinnitz, by saying I had been in Auschwitz and it was the worst concentration camp, now I was in a different camp?
Well, the contrast between Auschwitz and Brinnitz was so tremendous that, Auschwitz was a nightmare of everyone's life. I don't know who went through Auschwitz. If we wouldn't be taken out, saved by Mr. Schindler, I don't think personally I and many, many others wouldn't have survived. It was the hell, the pure, literal hell. When we came to Brinnitz, there was hope again. Of course, we were hungry, and we were getting hungry by the day, but we were not afraid. We knew Mr. Schindler, even if the women guards were yelling at us or sometimes hit somebody, but there was no torture. There was no selection. He did not allow any outside Germans he watched over us like a guardian angel. And even though we were very hungry in Brinnitz but we didn't care anymore. We knew this is war, we have to go through with it, and somehow, thanks to Mr. Schindler, we're going. It was like what I call Palm Springs of the war, that's how I called it.
Milla, you were described as a metal worker on the Schindler list.
The Schindler, well, he probably had, I'm sorry.
If you would start that by saying, I was just on the list as a metal worker.
Okay. I was described on the list as a metal worker because probably Mr. Schindler couldn't get us on the list because we were supposedly essential to the war effort. But of course, I was no metal worker. Most of the women were not metal workers, none of them, as a matter of fact. When we came, we were given, our work consisted of cleaning up, I think you call it shells, right? Cleaning shells, which we did forever. I don't think what the production was. As I understand, there was zero production, and sometimes our shells were considered defective. So Mr. Schindler had to buy from another factory some other shells and send away as the perfect ones. So really, we were inexperienced. We didn't care if we did a bad job. As a matter of fact, we wanted to sabotage it if we could, without detection. So I was described as a metal worker, but I was not.
Milla, tell me about liberation, the last day of the war, what you felt when Schindler left.
When Schindler left, we all felt very sad because it was kind of a vacuum, you know. The Germans left, the Russians didn't arrive yet, but we were delighted and so excited about the end of the war, but quite frankly, we didn't know what's going to happen next. The German troops were still retreating, and we were afraid, and we were told by Mr. Schindler to be careful, because if we would have gone beyond the gates of who knows what the reaction of the retreating German troops would be, you know. And in our camp, there was a big, like a hill in front of our camp, and we always dreamt during the free moments of our life in camp, what we're going to do when the war will be over. And we always dreamt we're going to go on the other side and see what life is. Then I think the next day after Mr. Schindler left, I think this was the 8th of May, the actual day of liberation. I think the whole world around us was liberated already except us. We saw a small man, a Russian soldier, with rags on his legs, and instead of shoes, and tied with ropes, he came on a horse. And of course, the excitement and the ecstasy was total. We were kissing his legs and his hands and everything. You know, we were so happy to be free. And then in the next few days, we ventured already outside, and we went to the village where people, the Czechs, were wonderful to us. As a matter of fact, I think they started to already come to the camp, bring us some food, you know, and so on. The population of that town around us, near the, I think it's Brno and Svitava, a little further, was mostly German. But there were Czechs there, and the Czechs were wonderful.